Excuse me. Well, thank you all for making the time to join us here today. I'm going to get right into it. Everything I'm going to talk about relates to what I like to describe as sort of a one world, one health approach. And what I mean by that is, for me, the work is all about the relationships between human health, wildlife health, domestic animal health, but all as underpinned by environmental stewardship. And I'm going to get a bit personal today because there's sort of been this convergence, as for many of us, between sort of my personal and professional trajectories. And I first got the opportunity to go to Africa in 1984. Harvard had these traveling fellowships, and I won a year of unrestricted travel to look at conservation problems from the perspectives of local people, governments, nonprofits, and that was really a transformative year. I was 21 years old, and I gave part of this talk yesterday. Yesterday I was actually wearing the same clothes, which was mortifying. So I made sure to wear different clothes today. But one of the things I learned in that very formative year was process matters. How you get from A to B matters as much as getting from A to B. And I remember thinking at the time that conservation was all about animals. And there's a lot of different disciplines in the room, but at that age, I really thought wildlife conservation was going to be all about wildlife. And veterinary work seemed like a logical course to pursue. And it really didn't take very long in that year to learn, to figure out that conservation is all about people, about human needs and aspirations, and understanding that its local people will ultimately decide whether a given area is going to remain under wildlife or be used for something else. And I learned that, to understand their perspectives, the people who live on the front lines with wildlife, for good and bad, you have to sometimes walk in their shoes, and sometimes you even have to wear their kangas. I don't keep that slide up very long. So with that as an introduction, my talk is called Beyond Fences: Policy Options for Wildlife, Livelihoods, and Transboundary Animal Disease Management in Southern Africa. And this work is a product of the AHEAD program, which stands for Animal and Human Health for the Environment and Development. This is a program I launched back in 2003, really as a reaction to my own professional experiences in places like Botswana and in East Africa, where different sectors were just not working together. And really, the AHEAD program is a facilitative mechanism. It's my attempt to bring different sectors, often literally to the same table, to hash out problems that often are focused on the same land that they all are working on. So this is another personal photo. This is from the early 1990s. This is a zebra dead along a foot and mouth disease control fence in Botswana. And this goes to the time when I was Botswana's first wildlife veterinary officer for their wildlife department. And I want to take you back even further, even to before I was born in the late 1950s, because this part of the world that I'm going to talk about today, Southern Africa, was very different then. Most of the countries you're familiar with were colonies or protectorates. So Zimbabwe was British Rhodesia. Namibia was German Southwest Africa. Botswana was the British protectorate of Bechuanaland. And this was before diamonds were discovered in this part of the world. These were poor, semi-arid areas, and colonial masters, if you will, were looking for ways to get economic traction. If you're a colonialist, that's what you do. And even in the late 1950s, they knew that there was a virus, the foot and mouth disease virus, that species, the buffalo, the African buffalo, carried, didn't get sick from, but could spread to cattle. And why is that important? It's because in their search for economic traction, and I'm obviously compressing history a bit, but the Germans and the British, they looked to beef, to livestock, as a source of revenue. And they realized that they wanted to get beef out of Southern Africa back to the mother countries, back to Europe. But they knew that this disease was in buffalo. So they decided, in order to try and safely move the beef without moving the disease, they would start to build fences. And they did that. They started to build fences. Some of my counterparts in veterinary medicine in the late 50s and early 60s started to build what turned into thousands of kilometers of fences over the ensuing decades, fences that were funded by World Bank, USAID, the European Union. This was largely externally funded, and I will, as objectively I can, describe what happened since then as a slow-motion environmental train wreck, where hundreds of thousands, if not millions of animals like the zebra have died along these fences because these fences cut off key migratory corridors that these animals need seasonally to access grazing in fresh water. At the time, the focus was on one sector. It was on livestock. Wildlife wasn't seen as a valued resource. There were no environmental impact assessments. So I don't want to look back in history and judge, because I wasn't there when these decisions were made. You can evaluate them in the context of the times. But that's sort of a short thumbnail history of what's happened in the region. And that's what I describe as sort of the bad news, at least from a conservationist point of view. Just to give you some perspective, the line diagram shows you just some of the major fences in this part of the world that I'm talking about. And if you're, pick your favorite antelope or wildebeest, and you need to go from A to B, you're just not going to be able to navigate that. The color picture, that's a double cordon fence. Those are maintenance roads, and they go on for miles. The fences themselves, I think I have a picture here, are double. They're about 12 feet high, and if they're well maintained, animals are just not going to get through them. That's the bad news, but I want to bring you to today, and what I think is good news. Today, nature-based nature-based activities contribute more to the gross domestic product of Southern Africa than agriculture, forestry, and fisheries combined. So that's a dramatic change since the late 50s in terms of the macroeconomic picture. And that is one that has not been lost upon the heads of state of the various regions of SADC. These countries have realized that wildlife is their global comparative advantage. Now, I want to explain what that's meant practically speaking. What that's meant is there's been a movement to create peace parks or transfrontier conservation areas, or TFCAs, to the point where there are now about a dozen of these areas. And I want to define this for you. A peace park or transfrontier conservation or TFCA is when two or more countries agree to reconnect, to rezone, if you will, across an international boundary between two national parks or a game reserve and a national park. It's really about recreating some of those corridors that have been lost, because wildlife is an economically competitive land use choice now. And if you add up all the area, those blue blotches that are being converted into these transfrontier conservation areas, it's about the same surface area as the state of New York, California, and Texas combined. This is, in all honesty, the biggest experiment in terrestrial conservation on the planet, and I don't think it's actually that well known. But again, the driver is largely economic, but that's okay, I'll take that. When students ask me what I do or what I've been doing for a living, I look at my job as making wildlife, finding ways to make wildlife an economically rational and socioculturally acceptable land use choice. And that's sort of the spirit of this transfrontier conservation area movement. So as I said, Southern Africa really has, Southern and East Africa really have the market in terms of opportunities related to nature, in terms of ecotourism, including photographic tourism and trophy hunting. They're never going to really compete in terms of beef globally. If you look at global beef flows, I think less than 1% actually come from Southern Africa. They're never going to compete with the Argentinas and Brazils of the world. But wildlife can really, and is, an economic engine, and that's driving this rethink of land use. So there are primary aims that these transfrontier conservation areas have come to agree on, and these are all under the umbrella of SADC, the Southern African Development Community. This is a truly regional initiative, and every peace park is made official by a signing of an international treaty by the heads of state of the countries involved. They're primarily focused on expanding opportunities for socioeconomic development. The peace component is real. Some of these countries have been, shooting at each other in recent times. So there really is a peace dimension to creating these transfrontier areas. And then obviously conserving biodiversity is among the top objectives. So I want to go a little bit deeper and use one example, the largest of the transfrontier conservation areas, and one that we've been working in for a long time. This is this amoeba over here is the Caza transfrontier conservation area. I'm going to tell you more about it. But I just superimposed it on the northeastern U.S. You can see these are vast, vast areas. I also want to be clear, this isn't about creating giant national parks. These are multi-use areas. It's really creative rezoning, reconnecting corridors, giving wildlife a chance to reconnect, which is really important from an ecological point of view, from a long-term population viability point of view. But these are still multi-use areas with all the things you would think about. There are roads and mining and agriculture. So Caza is a partnership among 5 countries: Angola, Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Slide, I need to update it. It's now at about 500,000 square kilometers, and there's now about 2.2, 2.3 million people in their livestock. Still relatively sparsely populated, which very much works in its favor. One of the other remarkable things about Caza, and if you're following the news, you know that elephants are under intensive poaching pressure. More than half of the world's elephants are in Caza. There are probably less than 500,000 elephants left on the planet, I'm sorry to say, considering that it wasn't that long ago that we had 20 million elephants. But Caza is critical to the long-term survival of the African elephant. as I mentioned, there are significant pressures, not just related to fences, but due to poaching, drought, extractive industry. This is a complex multi-use areas, and largely because of fencing and overhunting, most of the species in the region are on the decline. If you look at the long-term trajectory, if you look at the movie and not just the photograph. And it's interesting because if you're a tourist and you go to Southern Africa, it still is remarkable. But people have wandering baseline. If you didn't grow up in the region or you don't know the history, you won't realize how much things have declined. The other thing I'll just say in brief, and we might turn back to it later, the climate change models for Southern Africa all point to an ongoing drying trend. And from an adaptive point of view, in terms of climate change adaptation, about the only thing you can do, whether you're a pastoralist or a wildebeest, to adapt to this change is to be able to move north-south. And the fences that I've described also currently really preclude that. So the fences are also a problem in terms of climate change adaptation. The premise for why I got involved in this is that foot and mouth disease and the way we've tried to manage it compromises the entire vision of this peace park. And I'm going to tell you how. But before I do, again, I want to make sure I'm not oversimplifying. This is a different map of that same amoeba. This is where Angola, Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe converge. And what I want to show you here is a couple things. All the green shades are different types of protected areas. Some of them are community reserves, some of them are game reserves, some of them are national parks, some of them are hunting areas. But there are about 70 different types, sizes of protected areas in this matrix. And this peace park's vision is to, again, reconnect them. But if you're going to do this with 5 countries, there's a lot of other things you have to do, right? You have to reconcile revenue sharing. If we're going to bring in more tourists, at least today, Botswana is going to make more money than Angola is. Angola wants to participate in that, so there have to be revenue sharing agreements. There's got to be customs and immigration rules because you want the tourism experience to be expedited. You want people not to get held up at borders. You've got to reconcile legislation across boundaries. And today, because poaching is such a big problem, you need agreements in terms of law enforcement and their ability to move across borders to respond to poaching incidents, and that has to be negotiated among the 5 countries. So there's lots of things that have to go into this, but when I got involved about 15 years ago, it was because my sense was if we didn't deal with the fencing, everything else was moot. These peace parks were going to just be lines on a map because the fences are the physical barrier to the connectivity that make this system real from an ecological and long-term conservation point of view. So this to me typifies one of the things I really like to do, which is work on large landscape conservation. This is how I really got into the policy arena. I mean, I used to be sort of a hands-on field bed, hanging out of helicopters, darting elephants, doing fun stuff like that. But it didn't feel like the science was always getting used in the way that would influence change. But looking at these large landscapes and looking at where can you tip dominoes to really influence policy in a good way, that to me is a really exciting area to be working in. And as when I was 21 in my first trip to Africa, it's been very clear that the human dimension is front and center in making a transfrontier area work. And I want to be clear that even though Southern Africa is never going to be a major player in the global beef world, cattle are very important. They're important culturally, they're important socioeconomically, and they've been part of this landscape, for eons. I mean, in Botswana, which is at the center of Caza, there have been cattle at least since 600 AD. And we have to recognize it and use that information in the way we think about the problems we're trying to solve. So the good news for you guys, I see some folks from the vet school here, but I'm not going to try and make you all veterinarians today. What I will point out is that if you have among the most diverse assemblage of cloven-hoofed animals in the world, like we do in Southern Africa, you're unfortunately also going to have among the most diverse assemblages of diseases that affect animals. We call them transboundary animal diseases, and there are quite a few. I'm only going to focus on foot and mouth because our response to foot and mouth is so dramatic in terms of its impact on land use planning. And the fact is, there's no other disease up there that has the implications that foot and mouth does for international trade and economics. So I just want to recap a little bit because I know I've covered a lot. What we have is a fundamental land use conundrum where transfrontier conservation areas really require this free movement of wildlife across these vast areas, and yet the currently accepted international approaches to managing foot and mouth are those fences. It's not just from the colonial era. The whole world has accepted this. This is the global standard. Separate your wildlife from your livestock with fences. So those two things are in direct conflict, right? And we've recognized that, and we've also recognized that truly sustainable livelihoods demand that that conflict be reconciled because it's really causing problems. So what do I mean by that? I want to just give you a specific example. This is a picture of Botswana, and they have this system of zones made by these fences. And sometimes people think that business as usual, this way that this has been going on for decades, has been good for poverty alleviation. And the truth is, if you are the poorest of the poor pastoralists, if you're living in Ngamiland, northern Botswana, around the Okavango Delta, you are in that pink or red zone. That's a dirty zone. You live too close to wildlife. You are not allowed to access international markets. Okay, so it's not until you get into the green zones, farther away from the main wildlife areas, that you get potential access to markets like the EU. And so there's been an equity issue from the start, and a lot of people don't realize that. So the old system isn't necessarily equitable. At the same time, if you look at the statistics, and I've picked Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, going back to the 1980s, all you need to know is that is the incidence of foot and mouth in the last few decades where outbreaks are getting worse and worse. If you open any newspaper in the region, almost every other week there's another foot and mouth outbreak. The fences aren't being maintained, the vaccine strains they're using aren't well matched to the circulating strains, and it's been a highly subsidized system, and the governments no longer really have the resources to put in those subsidies to make it work. So this is a bit of a crisis, but it is a great example of when there's a crisis, there's an opportunity. So I want to take you back to our Caza amoeba shape and show you why this is important. The international group that is working on this among the 5 countries has now identified about half a dozen key corridors that are currently blocked by a combination of fences, natural barriers, human habitation, that if this is not reconciled, the long-term viability of wildlife, including species like elephants, is compromised. And so this argument that I've made is quite relevant because a lot of these areas are compromised in part or in whole by these veterinary fences. And I'll just give you an example. It's a complicated one. In the interest of time, I have to simplify. But all the black and yellow lines that you may or may not be able to see are FMD control fences. And right here, I don't know, it has a pointer. This pocket here, you can see what happened. They built these fences, and they made a big pocket. And this is the Kavango River. These animals here are all bottled up. There are about 15,000 elephants stuck in this pocket, and the human-elephant conflict is intense. There's lots of human habitation here. And so this is just explosive. Just one example, if we can get this policy straightened out, and we're going to talk about that, this corridor, called the Kwando Corridor, could be opened up from about 30 kilometers to about 100 kilometers. We basically flip this, have the animals that are in here no longer be pocketed in, and this major route from Botswana, the Okavango, through Namibia's Zambezi region, formerly the Caprivi Strip, into Angola, would be much more accessible for the wildlife that need to move there. So that's just a practical example. If we can deal with this foot and mouth disease policy, we have a chance of reconciling land use planning in a very creative and constructive way. So again, we're talking about development, we're talking about poverty alleviation, and we're talking about conservation, all related. So livestock agriculture and biodiversity conservation are both essential. That's been clear. It's not going to be either or. Neither one of those activities is sufficient to lift people out of poverty, but the combination is very powerful. Attempts to control foot and mouth using these fences is compromised resilience. I've shown you that the system's broken down, it's not working, wildlife populations are on the decline, and frankly, it's not an equitable system. And frankly, farmers blame wildlife for this. If they can't sell their cattle because there's a foot and mouth outbreak, they've been conditioned over generations to reflexively blame wildlife, and it creates conflict and antipathy. And that's not helping us build a constituency for a more variable or diversified land use portfolio. So what are the key challenges here? I want to be clear, because foot and mouth, in the world, foot and mouth is a problem in many parts of the world. The African buffalo is the only species we know of that naturally harbors this virus. So you can't get rid of it. People have talked about finding a vaccine that you could maybe spray from airplanes over buffalo. It's not going to happen, I don't think, in our lifetime. The only way you can get rid of it is if you killed all the buffalo. That's hopefully not going to happen either, because buffalo are very important economically and ecologically. The current internationally accepted approaches to the management of this disease continue to constrain development. I've tried to make that case for you. And the approaches are failing and development is failing. So right now we have what's really becoming a lose-lose, where foot and mouth outbreaks are on the rise, conservation opportunities are being lost. So we need a solution, and that's what we've been working on in that facilitative mechanism I described to you, the AHEAD program. We need a solution that does three things. It has to help pastoralists and farmers, obviously. They need help. Whatever we come up with can't threaten free-range wildlife. They are also an important part of the picture in terms of economic growth. And very importantly, whatever we do, we have to provide confidence to the countries that might buy beef from the region that they're not going to bring in foot and mouth. I don't know if you remember, we've had major outbreaks. There was one in the UK years ago, billions of dollars of damage, farmers committing suicide. When foot and mouth gets where it's not supposed to be, it wreaks havoc because of its trade implications. So we've got to check these 3 boxes if we're going to change the dynamic. And I want to confess, for the first time on the campus of Cornell University, the lectures that were probably most important in my career at the end of Tower Road on meat science, I fell asleep during. And I regret it to this day, because I've had to draw on that now in my day-to-day work. I didn't really fall asleep, but you get my point. It wasn't the most interesting stuff. But it turns out there are very simple ways to make meat safe in terms of moving it around the world. And we know, for example, that if you debone the meat and you take out the lymph nodes and you age it, the pH drops below 6, and it is scientifically proven that the foot and mouth disease virus cannot survive that process. Well, that struck me as rather important. And I worked with a number of colleagues, including folks like Gavin Thompson, who's a world-renowned virologist in the region, and we started to look at how we got to where we are. How did we get to this system? And there's some very important dynamics at play, and I'm going to have to give you a mini lecture on World Trade Organization, WTO policy. So everybody stretch, wake up. It's not as dry as it sounds. It's actually quite interesting. We are experiencing what is really the product of historical accidents. On the near side of this diagram here is this column is describing the Codex Alimentarius, which is the global agreement that tries to make sure that when you get a hamburger, you don't get salmonella or E. coli. It's about food systems and food safety, and it's under the auspices of FAO and WHO, 2 UN organizations. And the way they do that is they look at processing. They look at the value chain, how a product goes, from the proverbial, farm to fork. At each step, how is it made safe in terms of viruses, bacteria, parasites? Okay? They use what's called hazard analysis critical control points, where you monitor, processes so that each step is done safely. That's the Codex Alimentarius. But on the far side, that column is what's called the Terrestrial Animal Health Code, and that guides preventing the movement of diseases of animals, not food safety, but diseases like foot and mouth that can be moved through meat. It governs the movement of meat, milk, eggs, products like that. And their basis is geographic. They rely on what is the disease status of the place of origin. They want to know, did that cow live near a buffalo that might have foot and mouth? They don't really look at how that meat is processed. So that's what's called the geographic approach. And the OIE, how many of you have heard of the OIE? Very small portion. And I always ask that question because it's another well-kept secret. The OIE is based in Paris. Virtually every country in the world is a member, and they make the rules for the movements of animals and other products. Incredibly important, but they're not part of the UN. They're actually older than the UN. So for purely historical reasons, we have 2 bureaucracies that evolved, one dealing with geography and the zone that you come from if you're a product, and one dealing with food safety from a process point of view. But they're doing the same thing. They're completely redundant. They're all trying to deal with biohazards. They're trying to make sure that these products don't move bacteria, viruses, or parasites around. So we've been saying for more than 10 years, can't we do this the same way? Can't we look at the processing side of this, the processing of the commodity, and not worry about zonation? And by working with our colleagues in the region, we've gotten significant headway. And I'm going to steal my own thunder a bit. We've actually gotten the international rules changed last May 2015. The OIE, for the first time, agreed that we were right, basically. In partnership with SADC, we presented this to the OIE, working with FAO and the African Union, and they said, yeah, I guess that's true. And that is a watershed development. I want to tell you more why. But better than telling you, I'm going to show you. So I'm going to show you a film that we made. And I tell students, and I'm going to talk more about this, but you've got to publish, you've got to have good science for decision makers to take you seriously, to be credible. But I will tell you, this 20-minute film, which we made, cost probably all told $70,000, $80,000, took us almost 3 years. It's a true story. It's been the single most useful communications thing we've ever done. Most of the decision makers that I've been trying to influence, they don't read the literature. They don't read the papers we publish. But this story, which we've distributed in multiple languages on DVD around the region, has really hit home because it's grounded in the realities of the region. So the AV guy taught me how to do this. Give me a second. I'm going to switch to the film, and then I'm going to summarize, and we'll talk about it. But I think you'll find it. If this isn't the best movie on foot and mouth disease in Namibia you've ever seen, you get your money back. Okay. All right, let's see.
Robin Lyonga can't believe what he has just been told. A single cow, many miles from here, has foot and mouth disease. The abattoir has been closed, and although Robin's cattle are healthy, he can no longer sell his animals for the money his family desperately needs. When it comes to animal products, powerful trading countries subject Robin and millions of other cattle farmers like him to unreasonable demands. Robin needs to sell his cattle to the export market because that is where he can get the best price. But to get his animals to the export-accredited abattoir requires much time and effort. Because he cannot afford transport, he has to herd his cattle on foot for nearly 4 days to reach the nearest quarantine camp. His cattle then have to stay in the quarantine camp for 3 weeks. Robin lives in the Caprivi region of northern Namibia. Here, green floodplains are grazed by large herds of wildlife. The scenic rivers and wetlands harbor an incredible array of water-dependent animals and birds. But beyond the rivers, the land is semi-arid. The climate is harsh and the rains unpredictable. Thousands of people live in small villages, scratching out a living by farming this semi-arid land. Most depend on maize, fish, and wild plants for food. Their cattle are too valuable to eat. Because of poverty, poaching was once widespread. Local people hunted many species to near extinction. The Namibian government responded to this crisis. They persuaded rural communities to become involved in nature conservation, to form conservancies, and to earn money from sustainable use of their wildlife and natural environment. 5 years ago, Robin Lyonga became an active member of the Mashi Conservancy. For many days, he walked from village to village, convincing people in his community to join the Conservancy and commit to a new way of life with environmental conservation as a priority. The then young Mashi Conservancy began to make headway through the efforts of Robin and others like him. It all made sense to Robin. Protecting the environment ensures a long-term future for his children. But he soon learned, wildlife business will not fully support everyone. Farming, and especially cattle farming, is equally vital. Almost all the families here have cattle. It's in their culture, a centuries-old tradition and economic lifeline. Two national parks, now teeming with wildlife, surround Robin's village. Robin's house lies on an invisible boundary. Every day, when he and his family take their cattle to graze, they have to respect the boundary line. The rule is simple. The grass on this side is for the cattle. On the other side, it's for the wild animals. Cattle are wealth for farmers like Robin. They represent a bank account, a retirement policy, and education for the children. Selling a cow or ox supplements their income when times are tough. It always has. So it was a long process establishing the Marshy Conservancy, convincing farmers of the advantages of conserving wildlife. 15 game guards were chosen from the community to protect the wildlife.
We've got 2 spores. This is a zebra spore.
People in the community had to agree to stop poaching. The guards were given the authority to confiscate snares and prosecute offenders. The Marshy Conservancy is part of a much larger master plan. 5 countries, connected by the Zambezi and Okavango river systems, will create one of the largest conservation areas in the world. The Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area is blessed with extraordinary numbers and diversity of wildlife and includes major wetlands such as the Okavango Delta. It is a sanctuary to about 250,000 elephants, the largest population in the world. Tourists from all over the world come to this region to experience the vast unspoilt wilderness and spectacular wildlife. The government assisted the conservancy by releasing more game into the area. Luxury game lodges are licensed to operate in Marshy. In exchange, they pay a percentage of their revenues to the conservancy. Campsites were set up for more adventurous tourists. All this activity created employment, but not enough. So for Robin, there is a difficulty. Who should get a job and who not?
The money is definitely not enough.
At the first annual meeting, members make it clear that they experience very little direct benefit from the conservancy.
How can management receive money, but the rest of the community so little? If the management can't raise enough funds, then we should appoint new people.
But there is some progress. The community decides to pool income and buy a vehicle. Robin becomes the proud driver of the new pickup. Soon, sick people are being taken to the clinic and the old are transported where they need to go. For the women making crafts, the vehicle has become a lifeline. They can now display their wares in a kiosk on the main road where many tourists visit and spend money. Life has started to change in Marshy. Game numbers are on the increase. The free movement of animals enables cattle and wild buffalo to graze and drink water together. Unfortunately, healthy buffalo are able to transmit foot and mouth disease viruses to cattle. Buffalo herds maintain these viruses continuously. The viruses have no effect on the buffalo, but cause disease when the cattle are infected. Foot and mouth disease is a feared but badly misunderstood disease. In reality, it is a mild disease that rarely kills livestock and does not infect people. Its massive impact relates to outdated international trade practices. With wildlife numbers increasing, the government grants the Marshy Conservancy their first hunting quota. A limited number of game animals are offered to international hunters who are only too happy to pay handsomely for the experience and their trophies. After the hunt, the hunters help to distribute the meat among the members of the conservancy. For many, it will be their first taste of fresh meat in a long time. At the next annual general meeting, tangible evidence of the conservancy starting to deliver benefits becomes clear. But Robin knows it is still not enough to adequately change their lives. Even within his own family, he realizes that drastic measures are needed to lift themselves out of poverty. Robin's brother Dan works as a cleaner at a lodge. He wants to become a tourist guide and earn a better salary. But to do that, he must be qualified.
The course is very expensive, and I'll have to stop working while doing my studies.
Robin decided to call a family meeting to discuss raising money for Dan.
If we slaughter and sell cattle as meat, we will get 1,200 Namibian dollars per ox. If we sell them live to local traders, we could get 1,500 Namibian dollars.
3.6.
But if we take them to the quarantine camp, we might be able to get 3,500 Namibian dollars per ox.
Robin went back to Dan with the news that his family had agreed to sell some of their cattle to pay for the conservation course he needs to do. So, it came to pass that Robin set off on his journey, happy to go through all the rigmarole if it can improve Dan's life. The extended stay in the quarantine camp came to an end. That morning, veterinary services did a final check and certified his animals healthy and free from foot and mouth disease. And Robin was waiting for the truck from the abattoir to load his animals. But it was then that the quarantine master gave him the shocking news. A single cow 150 kilometers away has foot and mouth disease. The abattoir will no longer buy cattle from anywhere in the region. In fact, it will close for several months.
But why are we, here in the quarantine camp, punished for a sick cow many miles from here?
No one in the entire region will now be able to move their cattle. Even Robin's healthy cattle are locked into the quarantine camp and will now have to stay here for months. That is what the rules based on geographic management of foot and mouth disease require. The high-value beef markets around the world tell Robin and millions of other African farmers that they cannot trade their beef if they live in areas that are not recognized as free from foot and mouth disease. To do that in the Caprivi, where Robin lives, would mean getting rid of all the buffalo. Also, fences would need to be built around the Caprivi to keep the buffalo from surrounding countries out. But fences would seriously damage their conservation efforts, and buffalo are an important species for their growing ecotourism industry. There is currently no way to free the buffalo herds from the viruses that cause foot and mouth disease. Fortunately, the World Organization for Animal Health has introduced a standard to make it possible for farmers like Robin to trade their beef. This standard does not require geographic freedom from foot and mouth disease. But powerful countries ignore the new standard and continue to insist on geographical zoning. This long-standing requirement for disease-free zones has forced countries in southern Africa to erect enormously long and environmentally damaging veterinary cordon fences. The result is devastating. In an effort to trade, they have had to separate wildlife populations that maintain foot and mouth viruses from cattle raising areas. The result has been that natural migration routes needed by wild animals to reach seasonal water sources and grazing have been blocked, and wildlife numbers have dwindled. To counter this loss in biodiversity, 14 transfrontier conservation areas have been or are being established in southern Africa. The movement is an effort to conserve some of the world's most valuable remaining wilderness and wildlife areas. The objective is to remove some of the fences in order to re-establish natural wildlife movements across international boundaries. It is an exciting development for conservation, but it has huge consequences for cattle farmers like Robin, who want to sell their cattle for a good price. But if all the countries accept the non-geographic standard, a new world would open up for millions of farmers like Robin. According to this standard, the important requirements are that foot and mouth disease must not have occurred within a 10-kilometer radius of Robin's village in the last 30 days. His cattle must be vaccinated regularly against foot and mouth disease. Most importantly, quarantine is no longer required, but Robin must transport his cattle by disinfected vehicle directly to the approved abattoir. At the abattoir, his cattle need to undergo inspection before and after slaughter to ensure they are healthy. After slaughtering, the beef must be matured for at least 24 hours to ensure the pH falls below 6.0. The beef also needs to be deboned and lymph nodes removed. It's a scientific fact. Matured, deboned beef with a pH value of less than 6 is safe and cannot spread foot and mouth disease. Regulations that concentrate on the safety of the product itself will be far more effective in preventing the spread of diseases across international boundaries. Robin's matured, deboned beef is safe, and therefore it is irrelevant whether his cattle come from an area where buffalo are present. Imagine if Robin and his community were paid international prices for their natural beef at the same time as they were conserving wildlife, our priceless heritage. Then there will be money for Dan and other young people to go to school and even college. Cattle farmers will have an interest in improved disease control. Local communities will be positive about conservation. The better they protect the wildlife, the more income it will generate. All but one of the pieces of this imagined future are in place. The conservation areas are underway. The private sector is engaged. The approved abattoir is in place. The international market for beef is vibrant. All that is missing is powerful countries that refuse to trade beef according to scientifically founded international trade rules. They still insist on production practices that have environmentally disastrous effects on some of the world's most irreplaceable habitats. Robin Lyonga is a conservationist and a cattle farmer. He and his community produce healthy cattle in harmony with nature and international standards. They more than deserve the benefits of their conservation efforts and the fruit of their labor.
All right, so I'm going to update you on what's happened since that film was made. Because that film, I really think, changed the dynamic. When that film was made, the OIE had not come together and formally changed all the rules. In May, like I said, they did. And so now for the first time in about 70 years, these countries have an opportunity to employ this new method. And as I said before, it's all based on the commodity as you saw in the film. All this work, as I like to emphasize, is grounded in real science. We've published a lot on this. The journal Transboundary and Emerging Diseases is the type of journal that chief veterinary officers around the world actually read. They're the ones who vote. And when this came up for a vote in May, it was unanimous. So for us, it's the head of USDA APHIS, the chief veterinary officer of the United States, who would vote on behalf of the United States. But I want to be clear that the science is really just the foundation. It's the relationships in the region. It's the buy-in from regional stakeholders, particularly SADC. This is from 2012, where we had a very big meeting with the Southern African Development Community. And I actually brought colleagues from OIE and FAO to Southern Africa to listen to the deliberations. We showed the film. And I think these processes, which were very high transaction costs, donors don't like to fund workshops, but we've been doing that for over 10 years to get where we are. And I don't know how else we could have done it. And it really has been a breakthrough. And as I said before, it's about a combination of tourism opportunities, livestock-based opportunities, so that farmers and wildlife both benefit. This change is not only relevant to Southern Africa. We have places like Mongolia, which have similar conflicts between the Mongolian gazelles and livestock, where Russia, China, and Mongolia come together. In that case, the gazelles are actually victims of the virus. They're not vectors. They're not like buffalo. But this policy has implications. In Tanzania, those of you who know the Serengeti, the government of Tanzania periodically talks about building fences and going the way that Southern Africa did, even though it's no longer working. They're looking at this change, and I think it will hopefully preclude what could be an ecologically damaging decision in a place like Tanzania. I think it's important to convey how time-consuming this type of change is. I mean, I want students to appreciate that, you know, it's orders of magnitude more difficult than just doing the science. It's doing the science and engaging policymakers from the start. So what's the next step? I'm on my way back to Southern Africa in a month. We have 2 meetings back-to-back, one called the State of Caza, where the 5 countries are coming together to review their progress overall on the entity that I've described to you. And then attached to that, we have a 2-day workshop just on the OIE change, because this just happened. Now we need decision makers, farmers' unions, livestock officials to all understand what the new rules say and how they can implement them. So, and that's probably going to take at least another 5 years. So we're bringing private sector folks together. We're bringing people from other countries like India, which is very successful using this already, using commodity-based trade, and trying to get the Southern Africans to recognize a few things. First of all, forget about Europe. They've really started to realize that the Europeans, who were referred to in the film, they're never going to buy this new standard. They're probably going to just not accept this meat. But within Africa itself, there's a growing middle class, increasing demand for beef. And the Southern Africans and the East Africans, they have been following the same rules. They have not been working together yet to implement this. So there's an opportunity there just within Africa. And then there's huge growing demands in Asia that the Southern Africans can potentially meet if they start to look at this new win-win opportunity. So it's an incremental thing. It's, you know, few steps at a time, but I don't know how else to do it. And it's just been great to have support from donors who are beyond, you know, the short funding thing. Yes, our funding cycles are short, but we often get renewed because we're showing incremental progress, and we have the support of the region, of the regional stakeholders, which is obviously key. So I just want to conclude by thanking USAID, the Rockefeller Foundation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for helping to make this possible, and we're going to continue. This program has come to Cornell. The AHEAD program is now part of Cornell University, and we want to build on it. And so stay tuned and invite me back in 5 years, and hopefully I'll have more good news. Thanks so much.